Hi, Professor Dyer here, talking about false beliefs about children and families. There's evidence from many academic disciplines that when students come into a college classroom with false beliefs, incorrect beliefs about the subject matter of the class, that makes it hard for them to learn the truth. The false beliefs, especially when they go unchallenged by the instructor, kind of serve as a gatekeeper, only letting information pass if it seems to confirm the false belief, and just essentially putting up a barrier to anything new and different. Obviously, this is a problem. I teach in a department of human development and family science. So we teach classes about child development and about family relationships. They're very important topics. Some of my colleagues and I, shown here, have been investigating what are the false beliefs that students come into our department with, they come into our classes with. The hope is that if we can identify the common false beliefs, we can do a better job addressing them, and in the end, our students will learn more. So today, I want to share with you the top 5 false beliefs about children and families that I see among my students at Fresno State. Okay, number 5, believed by 68% of incoming students. Strangers tamper with Halloween candy. If you were like me, you were raised by parents who had to go through your candy bag before you could eat anything. They looked for things like razor blades and apples, and in packaged candy, things that were homemade. Rice Krispie treats were pretty dangerous, and we were never really allowed to eat them because there was this belief that it was a huge risk that people were tampering with Halloween candy all the time. Today, my students still believe this is true, although they tell me that lately the lore is that candy has been laced with fentanyl. So now instead of razor blades, it's dangerous drugs are being are tainting the Halloween candy. It just turns out there's never been a single documented case of this kind of candy tampering by a stranger. There have been a couple of stories that have really cemented these fears in the public's mind. There was a parent who killed his own child tragically. He believed that there was lots of candy tampering going on, so he could hide what he did that way. So he tampered with candy and gave it to all his kids' friends, on the mistaken belief that the police would assume that some other wacko out there had interfered with all of their candy, and his kid was the only kid unlucky enough to die from it, but nobody fell for it, and he's in prison now. Similarly, there was a child who died from consuming illicit drugs that he found in his parents' home. They knew they were going to get in trouble for making that substance available to him, and so they tried to cover up by saying it must have been in the Halloween candy. So these stories really cemented this idea in the public's mind. Kids do sometimes insert sewing needles and these kinds of things into candy as a prank, but to date, every case that has been discovered is this kind of prank without the intention of truly harming kids, and no kids have actually been harmed. This is basically an urban legend. It's not true. Okay, next. 78% of my students believe that sugar makes kids hyper. If you work with kids, if you have kids, if you were ever a kid, this makes sense. On days when kids have access to lots of sugar, so maybe Halloween, maybe someone's birthday party, other holidays where kids have access to lots of sweets, they tend to be kind of ramped up. And that's true. I can see why people believe this. It's the causal relationship that just isn't true, that it's the sugar that's making kids hyper. This has been tested quite a lot, and sometimes with randomized controlled trials. And what we find is that when the child and the parent and everyone looking at the situation is blind to whether the child had sugar or some kind of artificial sweetener, They can't tell a difference. There is no measurable change in the behavior of kids when they've consumed even a lot of sugar. Some people say, well, maybe it's not true for all kids, but my kid is really sugar sensitive, so maybe it's only sugar sensitive kids that this happens to. It's an interesting hypothesis, has been tested on children identified by their parents as especially sugar sensitive, and the results are the same. The truth is that sugar does not change kids' behavior. All of this is in parental perception, and once we believe something to be true, confirmation bias sets in, and we see examples of it being true all the time, and kind of ignore examples where it's not true. But this one is just false. Okay, number 3, frequent praise raises kids' self-esteem. I'm sure you've heard this, that we're supposed to be all the time telling kids we love how amazing they are, how wonderful they are, how beautiful and handsome they are, and how smart they are. And we're supposed to be giving them all kinds of messages that would build them up. And the idea is that if we build them up in terms of their self-esteem, then they will have the courage to try things that maybe they aren't so good at, but they'll have more experience, they'll be go-getters, and they'll be confident, and that confidence will bring them success in life. It turns out none of this scenario is true. This is called the self-esteem movement, and the whole thing has been debunked. It is true that sometimes kids who are performing at a higher level seem to have a higher self-esteem. They're confident and they are aware of their skills. And sometimes that's true, although sometimes that is not true at all. But it would be reasonable then for someone to say, well, maybe if they had the confidence, that would produce the success. But the truth is that it's the success that produces the confidence. It just kind of goes in the opposite way. High performance comes first, self-esteem follows. What if we embarked on this strategy where we tell them how amazing and wonderful and smart and everything they are all the time? Would that make them feel better about themselves? It turns out not really, because children are very perceptive and they notice when our praise is inauthentic, when it is much more dramatic than their performance would warrant, for instance. Or when we don't really believe it, we're just saying the thing that we have been told we're supposed to say. Kids recognize the inauthenticity and they kind of take on the message, the overall message, which is, I'm not that great and my parent feels sorry for me, and that's why they're being kind of manipulative this way, offering me inauthentic praise. Now, they can't articulate it that way, but that seems to be what's happening. They also find non-specific praise to be manipulative. So when we say, you did a great job, it's not specific. What did I do that was great? What was the part of that you're noticing? It doesn't mean anything when we say it, and they know it, and it doesn't mean anything when they hear it. There's a lot I could say about this, one of my favorite topics, but I'm going to try to keep this short. So I'll just say as a teaser, what should we be doing for kids, if not heaping piles of praise on them to help them be successful? Well, what we know is that children use feedback. They use feedback. It has to be authentic. It has to be true. It has to be specific. So if we noticed that they were balancing the bike pretty effectively when they first got on it, even though they were a little scared, and we say, I noticed that you balanced on the bike when you first got on it, even though you were scared, that's very specific. And that kind of feedback helps them. I will say that kind of specific feedback helps when it's positive, that you did something that worked, and that kind of specific feedback even helps when it's negative. But I noticed that you kept looking at the ground instead of looking where you were headed. That might be why you lost your balance in the end. See, that would be maybe sort of criticism, because it's very specific, but it's It's not, you're great, it's here's a problem, but specific feedback is helpful. The second thing about feedback is that it should be non-evaluative. We really don't need to be telling them how fabulous or how terrible they are. We need to be describing the behaviors to help them zero in on the task itself, to understand the task, and our evaluations of whether they are morally good or bad because of what they're doing, that just isn't helpful. Okay, number 2, most people have a learning style. About 80% of my students believe this, but surveys of elementary school teachers suggest that like 95% of them believe this, and they try to tailor their instruction based on the learning styles of the kids in their classes. Try to make material available in a wide variety of modalities and so on and so forth. It's just, it sounds great. The problem is that it's just not true. Most people do not have a learning style. How people learn is when the modality is matched to the content that they're being taught. There are certain kinds of content that's better taught visually, other kinds of content better taught kinesthetically. So there are some differences that way, but it's not based on the learner's style. It's based on the match between the content and the teaching or the instruction. In truth, the vast majority of people can't be classified as having a learning style. Most of us learn in multiple different modalities depending on what it is we're learning. Very few people, in fact, it looks like maybe 5%, could in some way be classified as having a clear preference. That's not a big number. And even among those people, if they are taught, if they're offered information in their preferred style, they don't learn it any better than if it is presented to them in a different modality. So learning styles, they're just not real. They don't exist. Top most frequently believed false statement is that men and women have different communication styles. This is the idea that men and women men are from Mars, women are from Venus, right? They have different they have a different language, they have a different way of thinking about the world, and this is why they have difficulty communicating. So if you have problems that arise in a romantic relationship, it's probably just because you're communicating about it differently. This is pretty tempting because many of us have encountered communication difficulties, and it's nice to have an easy explanation for it. The problem is it's incorrect. It's not true that men and women have predictably different communication styles. The truth is there's more variation between people of the same gender than there are between men and women as groups. Yeah, communicating in intimate relationships can be challenging, and there are some problems that pop up predictably, but they're not about gender. I will leave you with something to explore if you want to know more about communication in intimate relationships that is not pseudoscientific. John Gottman's work is evidence-based, and he provides lots of good information about communication in intimate relationships. The title of the book is a little outdated. These things work regardless of marriage, marital status or not. They're generally true, but that's a great book and one you might consider. Well, thanks for going on this little tour with me of things that people commonly falsely believe about children and families. It might start to feel like everything you think you know is wrong, and I'm sorry about that. I don't want people to leave with no sense of their own knowledge, but it's okay if you're a little shaken, because recognizing that our common sense and our personal experiences can sometimes lead us to the wrong conclusions about important topics, that is the first step to learning something new. Thanks.